There are a few things I need to nail before I start writing: the financial details, the cultural context, and the emotional arc. Let me think through the new story structure first. New story blueprint. Narrator, male, 58 years old, retired union electrician from Ohio son, mid-30s, married up socially, works in finance in Chicago, daughter-in-law from wealthy suburban family. Image-conscious setting. Son's 10th wedding anniversary party. Narrator excluded from the important table. Sacrifice. Narrator co-signed and made down payments on son's first condo, $320K, then helped buy their current house, $680K, all documented. All in narrator's name as partial owner villain moment. Narrator overhears son tell wife, "Just keep dad in the back, he'll embarrass us with the Hendersons." Silent revenge. Narrator calls his attorney the next morning, files to sell his ownership stake. Names chosen, none from the banned list. Narrator equals unnamed son equals Caleb. Daughter-in-law equals Meredith. Son's boss, friend, equals the Hendersons. Narrator's late wife equals June. Narrator's sister equals Patrice. I found out I was an embarrassment at my own son's anniversary party. Not from a fight, not from a scene. I found out because I walked around a corner at the wrong moment and heard my son's voice drop the way it does when he's trying to sound casual about something he's already decided. "Just keep dad at the back table with Uncle Ron," he said. "He'll be fine there. I just don't want him near the Hendersons all night." Meredith said something I couldn't fully hear. Her voice was low, the way it gets when she's already in agreement and just wants the conversation over. "He means well," my son said. You know how he gets. He talks too loud and the stories go on forever." I stood there in the hallway of their house holding a bottle of wine I'd brought from home. Chianti. His mother used to love Chianti. I'd driven 4 hours from Dayton that morning to be there. I was wearing the blazer I'd bought specifically for the occasion because Meredith had mentioned in passing, 3 weeks earlier, that it was going to be a nicer crowd. I turned around and walked back to the kitchen. I set the wine on the counter. I poured myself a glass of water and I stood there drinking it slowly, looking out at their backyard. It was a beautiful house, big yard, good bones, the kind of place that looks like it happened naturally but didn't. I know because I helped build it. Let me back up. My wife June passed 11 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 16 weeks from diagnosis to the end. Caleb was 26 when we lost her, and I'll tell you honestly, watching a young man lose his mother is one of the hardest things I've ever witnessed. He fell apart quietly, the way men in our family do. He didn't cry at the funeral. He cried in the parking lot of a Waffle House 2 days later, because they were out of the pecan pie she used to order. I sat across from him in that booth for 2 hours. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. He was always a good kid. I want to say that clearly because everything that comes later is easier to understand if you know who he was before. He worked summers at the shop with me. He carried his own weight. He wasn't afraid of a dirty job. When he got into Ohio State on a partial scholarship, I worked doubles every weekend his freshman year to cover what the aide didn't. I never told him that. It wasn't something I needed him to know. After graduation, he moved to Chicago for a job in financial consulting. I was proud. His mother would have cried at the dinner table, which she did about most things, which I loved about her. He was good at the work and moved up fast, the way sharp people do when they finally find their environment. He met Meredith at a firm event about a year in. She was in marketing. Her family was from the North Shore. Old money. Quiet about it the way old money usually is. She was smart and polished, and she made Caleb happy, and that was enough for me. They got married in 2015. Nice ceremony. I gave a toast. I talked about June, which I probably held together for about 45 seconds before I had to stop and clear my throat. People were kind. Meredith's father shook my hand afterward and said I seemed like a good man. I thought that was a good start. The money started in year 2 of their marriage. They were renting a 2-bedroom in Lincoln Park. Fine apartment, nice area, but rent was eating them alive and they wanted to buy. The market was moving fast, and Caleb called me one Sunday to talk through the numbers. They'd found a condo they loved, $320,000. Good building, solid HOA, close to the L. They had about $30,000 saved, which wasn't enough for a conventional down payment on top of closing costs. And Caleb's credit profile was thin because he'd avoided debt his whole life, which I'd always told him to do, and which was now working against him on paper. I had $68,000 in a savings account, emergency money, the kind you keep for when the roof goes or the furnace dies. I'd built it up over 20 years of weekend overtime and not buying things I didn't need. I said yes before he finished explaining the situation. I co-signed the mortgage and I put $52,000 toward the down payment and closing costs. I stayed on the title as partial owner, not because I wanted a claim on their home, but because the lender required it given my role in the transaction. The understanding between us was simple. They'd pay the mortgage every month, they'd build equity, and eventually they'd refinance and buy me off the title once they were on stronger financial footing. That's exactly what happened 3 years later. No drama. Clean handoff. But by then they'd outgrown the condo. The Chicago market had appreciated sharply. They sold the condo in 2020 for $398,000. After payoff and fees, they walked away with just over $81,000. Good outcome. The kind of outcome you work toward. But they'd also had their first child by then, a daughter named Iris, who I will mention separately because she matters to this story, and they wanted a house. Real yard. Garage. The whole thing. They found one in Evanston. 4 bedrooms. Finished basement. Detached garage. Asking price was $740,000. They offered $715,000 and got it. Their equity from the condo sale, combined with Meredith's savings, came to about $130,000. Enough for a down payment, but tight on reserves, and the mortgage payment at current rates was going to stretch them. Caleb came to me again. By this time, I was 54, and I'd just retired after 31 years as a union electrician with Local 82. My pension was solid. My house in Dayton was paid off. I had a little over $190,000 in my retirement savings that I wasn't touching for another decade, and I had $85,000 in liquid savings that had rebuilt itself slowly after the condo situation. I put in $60,000 to bring the reserves up and give them breathing room on the closing costs. Again, I went on the title, partial ownership, 11.3%, which reflected my contribution proportionally against the sale price. Again, the understanding was that this was temporary. They'd refinance when they could, buy me out, and the house would be fully theirs. That was 3.5 years ago. They hadn't refinanced yet. Rates had climbed and they were waiting for a better window. I wasn't pushing. It was their home. I didn't think about my name being on the deed most days. It was a technicality. Until it wasn't. Back to the hallway. The anniversary party was a Saturday in late April. 50 or 60 people, a caterer, a bartender. The house looked beautiful. Meredith has a real eye for that. I'll give her that without any sarcasm. She'd strung lights across the back patio and rented chairs with ivory covers and set up a long table under the pergola. Caleb and I had built together the summer before last. We'd spent an entire weekend on that thing. My knees were wrecked for a week afterward. It looked good. The Hendersons were the couple Caleb was worried about. I came to understand over the course of the evening that Greg Henderson was a senior partner at Caleb's firm. The kind of man whose opinion quietly shapes careers. Caleb had been positioning himself for promotion for 2 years, and Greg Henderson apparently represented a door that could open or stay closed depending on variables Caleb was very carefully managing. I was one of those variables. I sat at the back table with Ron, my brother-in-law, June's brother, who I love and who was perfectly happy to be in the back, because he brought his own flask and didn't care about any of it. We talked about baseball. We talked about June. He made me laugh twice with stories from before I knew her, which he does every time I see him, and which I'm grateful for every time. Caleb checked on me once around 7. He asked if I needed anything. He looked relieved when I said I was fine. He didn't stay. I watched him across the yard, He was smooth in that environment in a way I recognized and admired. The handshakes, the eye contact, the measured laugh. June always said he got his social intelligence from me, and maybe she was right. Though mine never got dressed up the way his did. I was proud of him even sitting there in the back. That's the honest truth. I was proud, and I was also something else that I didn't have a name for yet. I drove home to Dayton the next morning. 4 hours. I stopped once for gas and coffee. I didn't call Caleb. He texted around noon. "Thanks for coming, Dad. Sorry we didn't get more time together." I read it in the parking lot of a rest stop. I sat there for a while. I want to be fair to myself here, which is harder than it sounds. Part of me wanted to let it go. Part of me said, he's under pressure, the promotion matters. He didn't mean anything by the table arrangement. People do awkward things when they're managing up. I know that world isn't my world. I know I'm loud sometimes. I know my stories run long. June used to kick me under the dinner table when I got going and couldn't stop. But I kept coming back to one thing. He didn't say, Dad might be uncomfortable near people he doesn't know. He didn't say, Dad might feel out of place. He said, I don't want him near the Hendersons. Like I was something to be managed. Like my presence was a liability. Like the man who pulled doubles to pay his tuition and drained his savings twice so his son could build a life. Like that man was a problem to be kept in a back corner with the flask uncle. I got home. I watered my tomatoes. I had dinner alone. I watched the end of a game I didn't care about, and then I went to bed and lay there in the dark for a long time. In the morning, I called my attorney. Her name is Patricia Levine. She's been my attorney for 17 years. She handled the estate when June died. She's thorough, and she doesn't waste words, which I've always appreciated. I told her the situation. The Evanston house. The 11.3% ownership. What I wanted to do. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me if I was sure. I said I was sure. She explained the process clearly. As a partial owner, I had the right to petition for partition. Essentially a legal mechanism that forces the resolution of shared ownership. In practical terms, this meant I could demand that my stake be bought out at fair market value, or if the other party couldn't or wouldn't do so within a reasonable time frame, the property would be sold and proceeds distributed according to ownership percentages. The Evanston house had appreciated. Current estimated value was somewhere between $810,000 and $840,000. My 11.3% of $825,000, the midpoint was approximately $93,225. Patricia filed the notice the following week. Caleb called me on a Tuesday evening. I was in the garage when my phone rang. I let it ring twice, then answered, Dad. His voice was careful. I got a letter from an attorney. I know, I said. There was a long pause. What is this? It's a partition action, I said. Patricia can explain the specifics if you want to call her. Dad, why are you doing this? Did something happen? I almost said nothing happened. It would have been easier. But I'd spent 2 weeks deciding not to take the easy road on this. So I told him what I heard in the hallway. I kept my voice level. I didn't editorializing. I just told him what his words were and that I'd been standing around the corner when he said them. The silence that followed was the longest of the phone call. Dad, I'm not angry, I said, which was mostly true, but I've been thinking about it for 2 weeks, and I think it's time I got my name off that deed. That's all this is. You know that's not. I didn't mean it the way it sounds. I know you didn't mean for me to hear it, I said. That's different. He didn't have a response to that. We talked for another few minutes. He said he needed to talk to Meredith. I said that was fine. I told him Patricia's contact information was on the letter and she could walk them through the timeline. I told him I loved him, because I do, and I ended the call. Here's what happened financially, because I want to be clear about it so there's no confusion. The house was appraised at $832,000. My 11.3% came to 93,016s. Caleb and Meredith did not have 93,016s. Caleb and Meredith did not have $93,000 in liquid savings. No surprise, given the mortgage and childcare and the cost of living in Evanston. They had two options: find the money to buy me out, or let the partition process move forward and eventually list the house. They found the money. Meredith's parents loaned them $60,000. Caleb cashed out a portion of his investment account for the remainder. 6 weeks after the initial notice, I received a wire transfer of $93,016 and my name came off the deed. The house is fully theirs now. I want to tell you about Iris because she's the part of this that kept me up more than anything else. She's 7. She has June's eyes, that very specific shade of gray-green that I thought was unique to June, until I saw it in Iris at about 6 months old and had to leave the room for a minute. She likes dinosaurs and she likes doing puzzles, and she calls me Pop Pop with a slight emphasis on the second pop that I cannot explain and cannot replicate, and which is the best sound I've heard in years. I was worried when I filed the notice about what it would mean for her and me. That was my actual fear, not the money, not Caleb's reaction. The thought of Iris growing up in a house where there was distance between me and her parents, that's what I lay awake over. But something happened that I didn't anticipate. About 3 weeks after the buyout was complete, Caleb called me on a Sunday morning. Iris was in the background asking for something with the insistence only a 7-year-old can sustain. He put her off gently, and then he said, "I want to apologize. Properly, not over text." He came to Dayton the following weekend, without Meredith, which told me he'd thought carefully about this. We sat on the back porch, and I made coffee, and we talked for 3 hours. He told me he'd been carrying things he hadn't examined. Pressure from the promotion cycle, pressure from Meredith's family, who he liked but who moved in a world that made him feel like he was always being measured. He told me he'd been embarrassed, not of me, he said, but of the gap between who he'd become professionally and where he came from. He said he knew that distinction didn't make it better. I let him talk. I didn't interrupt, which is not my natural inclination, but which I've gotten better at in my 60s. When he was done, I told him that I wasn't looking for an apology. I was looking for a son who understood something, and I thought he did. I thought he understood it the way you understand things that cost you something. Not intellectually, but in the bones. We had lunch. He called me on the drive home. He said Iris had been asking about coming to Dayton to see Pop Pop's tomato garden. She came 2 weeks later. We picked tomatoes, and she asked me 47 questions about why worms are good for soil, and I answered every single one of them. We had BLTs for lunch with tomatoes we picked that morning, and she announced that it was the best sandwich she'd ever had, which I will accept without false modesty. Things with Caleb are different now. Not worse, different. There's something more honest between us the way there often is, after a hard conversation that both people survive. He calls on Sundays. He doesn't perform anymore when we talk. Last month, he told me about a difficult situation at work. Not for advice, just to tell me. And I sat on my porch in the dark and listened and felt like his father in a way I hadn't in a couple of years. I am not telling this story because I think I handled everything perfectly. I'm telling it because there's a version of this where I swallowed what I heard in that hallway and drove home and let it become one more quiet thing that sat between us and grew. I've seen that happen to men my age. It happens slowly, and then it's just how things are. And one day you're at a funeral realizing you didn't really know your own child. That's not what I wanted. What I wanted was to be seen, not celebrated, not put at the head of any table, just seen. The way you see someone when you know what they've given. Caleb knows now. I think Meredith does too, though we've had a different kind of conversation. Shorter, more careful, still finding its footing. That's okay. Some things take longer. I'm in no rush. My name came off that deed in early June. By late June, I had Iris chasing a worm through my garden, telling me it needed a name. She named it Gerald. I don't know why. I told her it was a fine name for a worm. The tomatoes that year were the best I've ever grown. I sent Caleb home with a bag of them. He texted me a photo 2 days later. Iris holding a tomato the size of her fist, grinning with all the pride of someone who was there at the very beginning. I saved that photo. It's on my phone right next to a picture of June holding Caleb in the hospital the day he was born, 34 years apart. Same eyes looking back at me. You do what you do for love, and then sometimes love has to get honest with itself. That's not a failure. That's just how it grows. People ask me sometimes if I regret it. If I wish I'd just let it go, driven home, swallowed what I heard in that hallway, and kept showing up the way I always had. I understand why they ask. On the surface, it looks like I blew up my relationship with my son over a seating arrangement at a party. That's the short version. And it's not wrong exactly, but it misses the thing underneath. What I know, and what I think Caleb knows now too, is that the moment I heard those words, something that had been accumulating for a long time, finally had a name. It wasn't the party. It wasn't even the back table. It was the years of showing up fully and being received partially. And the question I had to answer for myself, alone in that kitchen holding a bottle of wine his mother would have loved, was whether I was going to keep pretending I didn't feel it. I've watched men my age make both choices. I've seen men swallow things like this for decades and become quieter and quieter until one day they're just a signature on a birthday card. I've also seen men blow up relationships they could have repaired with something smaller than a legal filing. I don't think either of those is wisdom. What I think wisdom actually looks like is being honest about what you need and then doing the smallest thing necessary to make that need visible. Filing the partition notice was not revenge. I want to say that plainly. I didn't want Caleb to suffer. I didn't want Meredith to panic. I wanted my son to understand something that he was not going to understand any other way, that there are consequences to treating someone like a variable you manage instead of a person you love. That lesson, when it finally landed, cost him $93,000 and a very uncomfortable conversation with his in-laws. That's not nothing. But it was also not cruelty. It was cause and effect, as honest and unglamorous as that sounds. Here's what I've come to believe about the way character actually develops in a person. It doesn't happen in the easy stretches. It doesn't happen when everything is going well and the people around you are comfortable and nobody's feelings are at stake. It happens in the friction. It happens when something costs you enough that you have to sit with it and really look at what you did. Caleb sat with it. He drove to Dayton without Meredith. And he sat on my back porch, and he actually looked at it. That took courage. I don't give that credit lightly, and my part in it. My part was staying steady. Not cold, not punishing, not performing some version of wounded dignity. Just steady. Honest about what I heard, clear about what I needed, and then patient enough to let the rest find its own shape. That's the only thing I know how to call it. Not wisdom yet, maybe. But the direction wisdom goes. Iris named a worm Gerald, and I told her it was a fine name. June would have laughed herself sideways at that. The tomatoes that year were exceptional. The sandwich was perfect. My son called on Sunday. That's what it looks like when things go the right direction. Not dramatic, not ceremonial. Just a 7-year-old in a garden, a phone call on a Sunday, and two people who finally know where they actually stand.